Why is uglies so bad? If you've been watching this channel for a while now, then you've probably heard me talk about Uglies, which was one of my favorite dystopian YA series back when I was younger. Released in 2005, the first book introduced a 24th century society where everyone is ugly until they're 16, where they subsequently receive a mandatory cosmetic surgery that makes them pretty. The series' protagonist is Tally Youngblood, a 15-year-old girl who is counting down the days until her surgery as she can't wait to escape from her humdrum ugly life and join the seemingly carefree pretties. In typical YA fashion, things aren't what they seem, and over the course of the series, we see Tally discover her independence, fall in love, and change the world. I know that based on that description, it sounds exactly the same as any other YA series, but by incorporating beauty and fame into the genre's usual themes of conformity, identity, and inequality, it feels like the story has only become more relevant with time. During the dystopian craze of the 2010s, I waited with bated breath for Uglies to be announced as Hollywood's next book-to-movie adaptation, but was left disappointed when the trend peaked and plummeted before it ever got made. Although the series was originally in development at 20th Century Fox in 2006, nothing came of it until 2020 when the project re-entered development with Joey King as protagonist and executive producer. In 2021, they finally got to filming, but it was delayed once again for unknown reasons, sitting in limbo for a few years before finally being released on Netflix in September 2024. Like anyone who grew up reading the series, I was excited to finally see Uglies come to life. But after watching the movie, I couldn't possibly be more disappointed. Everything from the acting, to the writing, to the costumes, to the visual effects left a lot to be desired. And honestly, it might be one of the worst YA adaptations to date, apart from Maximum Ride, of course. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Uglies movie, including the changes to the source material, its biggest problems, and the very few positives. Obviously, there will be spoilers. Now let's get into it. The film begins with a heavy-handed info dump which explains how the Rusties of the past depleted the world of its natural resources, leading to chaos and war. In an attempt to save humanity, scientists create a genetically modified orchid as a new energy source, in addition to a procedure that gives everyone a standardized form of attractiveness, with the latter ideally solving conflicts caused by different physical appearances. Tally resides in the Ugly Dorms, a strictly regulated area where children who haven't had the pretty surgery live. One night she sneaks out to meet her best friend Paris, who is a few months older than she is, thereby receiving the surgery first. The two promise to stay friends regardless of the change, but following the procedure, Tally is unable to get in touch with him. Weeks pass, and Tally decides to sneak into New Pretty Town to see him, but his personality is equally as different as his appearance, and he brushes her off, telling her that they can be friends again once she's pretty herself. During this visit, Tally is discovered by security and flees back to the dormitories, where she meets Shay, a fellow ugly. The two bond over their rule-breaking and quickly become friends, with Shay teaching Tally how to hoverboard and telling her about the Smoke, a community of rebels who have refused the pretty surgery and live amongst nature. Sharing a birthday, the two are set to have their procedures the same day, but the night before, Shay decides to go to the Smoke, wanting to be free of their society's conformity. Although she asks Tally to come with her, Tally refuses as she still wants to become pretty, but she's subsequently denied her surgery by Dr. Cable, who demands that Tally find the Smoke and reveal their location. Although she initially rejects Dr. Cable's demands, after being treated as an outcast and speaking to Paris, she decides to go. Using a series of clues that Shay left behind, Tally begins the journey to the Smoke. Tally finds herself drawn to David and the smoky lifestyle, making her question returning to Dr. Cable. After being accepted by the group, Tally is introduced to David's parents, who discovered the truth about the surgeries, with the transformation hiding brain lesions that limit human intelligence and emotions, allowing them to be easily controlled. Tally also discovers that the white orchids are actually toxic, slowly destroying nature. This inspires Tally to renounce the pretty system, throwing her necklace into a fire, but unbeknownst to her, it sends out a signal. The following day, Dr. Cable arrives with a group of soldiers, including Paris, who has been modified into a near-invincible special. They capture all of the Smokies, but David and Tally are able to escape. Although upset about Tally's betrayal, which led to the death of his father, David accepts her offer of help, and the two set out to rescue the captured rebels. With the help of some uglies, David and Tally are able to break into the building where they free everyone. Everyone except Shay, who has already received the pretty procedure, turning her into a vapid and shallow shell of herself. They also battle with Dr. Cable and Paris, who falls into a river. During all of this, David's mother was able to finish the cure for the brain lesions, but because Shay doesn't consent, they refuse to force her to take it. Wanting to help the world, Tally decides to undergo the surgery in order to be their first test subject, and she tells them to come back for her later. After allowing herself to be captured, the film skips ahead to Tally as a pretty, but it's implied that she still remembers her objective. From start to finish, the film struggles with its pacing, somehow managing to feel rushed while simultaneously dragging on. There's a lot of unnecessary exposition, like the very beginning of the film where they tell us the history of the world, which Tally proceeds to repeat in class later on. Although they're included in the book, I would have removed the orchids from the movie, as they don't really have anything to do with the pretty procedure, which is the main draw of the franchise anyway. And since there's no clear-cut resolution like the brain lesions, it just feels like an afterthought. There's almost no sense of time passing, with the events of the film feeling like they took place over 2 weeks instead of several months. One of my favorite parts of the book was Tally's journey to the smoke, but the film fast-forwards through it, which is a shame because it really highlights the character's ingenuity and courage. I understand that dedicating 15 minutes to a solo trip might not have been all that interesting, but maybe the montage could have been a bit more detailed. At the very least, I wish we'd been able to get a sense of how much Tally hated Spag Bowl by the end. Tally's time at the smoke also feels rushed. She just shows up and immediately adapts to this entirely different lifestyle. There's no sense of fear or anxiety. The film also completely brushes over Tally's concerns about the environment, whereas in the book, she's initially disgusted by the fact that the Smokies cut down trees, making them seem as wasteful as the Rusties. The film's pacing also negatively impacts the action scenes, never giving us time to fully comprehend what's about to happen. Because there's no sense of tension, at no point do we ever think that Tally is in any real danger, and halfway through, we're so used to her falling off of stuff that it's basically a joke. As if this wasn't enough, the visual effects are also a total eyesore, making the movie look dated before it was even released. And anytime the characters were hoverboarding, it looked like a cutscene from a cheesy video game. One of the biggest differences between the book and the film is Paris and Tally's relationship, which goes from platonic to romantic. I can't say I'm totally surprised by the change, considering love triangles are now a staple of the YA genre thanks to Bella, Edward, and Jacob, but I don't really think the formula works in the Uglies movie. First of all, in the books, Paris isn't a major character, only popping up to serve as an example of the average pretty. Because of this, he doesn't really have the most interesting personality, which is made no better in the movie, with his only defining characteristics being his crush on Tally and his subservience. As a result, he's a pretty lackluster love interest, and at no point are you ever rooting for him and Tally to actually get together. In the books, Tally does have a more stereotypical love triangle, which includes David and Zane, a pretty prankster introduced in the sequel, and the two boys have their individual positive and negative attributes, making for a more interesting rivalry as they battle for Tally's affections, and as a result, you can understand why she struggles to choose between them. In the movie, David is the obvious choice, as he doesn't ditch Tally for more attractive friends or turn into an all-out murderer, so the trope just doesn't work the way that it should. Even though I don't like the change to begin with, there were ways to make it work, the most obvious being improving the setup of Paris and Tally's friendship. Instead of the clunky exposition dump at the beginning of the film and the weird flashbacks, they should have started with Tally moving into the dorms as a child and meeting Paris, where we could see them talk about their insecurities and teach each other tricks. There's nothing like young love to get an audience on your side. This way, when he turns pretty later on, we still have a connection to him regardless of how much he's changed. Then, when he gets brainwashed and becomes evil, we feel pity for him instead of nonchalance. But if I'm being honest, I would have preferred if they focused on a different relationship entirely, namely, the one between Tally and Shay. I don't know if it was just me, but as a kid, I distinctly remember thinking that their interactions had romantic subtext, something the film sort of hints at, but is afraid to fully commit to. In the books, the driving force behind many of Tally's actions are her love for Shay, going to the smoke to rescue her, and becoming pretty to help cure her. Meanwhile, Shay's love for Tally manifests in a more toxic way, namely, jealousy, and throughout the series, the two flip back and forth between being friends and enemies. It's not exactly an inspiring relationship dynamic, but there's a certain level of passion that makes it more interesting than Tally's other romantic relationships. In the books, Tally has a habit of dating the guys that Shay likes, something that becomes one of the main sources of tension in their friendship. In the film, we don't really see Shay pining over anyone. Instead, she's a lot more interested in who Tally likes. First, asking if she and Paris are dating, then asking about Tally's necklace, then becoming upset when she finds out about Tally and David's romance. I do think this was their way of incorporating the romantic undertones presented in the books, but I wish they'd taken it a step further. Maybe with an almost kiss? I also think their closeness could have been set up better overall, but in the film's current state, there'd be no time for it, which is another reason to get rid of Paris once he becomes pretty. Considering there isn't much to differentiate Uglies from other YA movies, having a different type of love triangle could have been interesting to see, especially if they decided to adapt the sequels, since Tally and Shay's friendship only becomes more complicated as time passes. Speaking of Shay, actress Brianne Chu is easily one of the best parts of the film. I do think she makes the character a lot more likable than she is in the novel, but considering everyone else is dull at best and irritating at worst, you need someone to root for. While she does a good job as the cool girl, I really enjoyed the switch to the ditzy, pretty Shay, who is just a hint of darkness that I think is crucial to the character. I don't know if it was the writing or the actors themselves, but the rest of the performances felt phoned in. Laverne Cox, who was great in Orange is the New Black, doesn't bring the coldness and cruelty I was expecting from Dr. Cable. She's just your ordinary, insincere villain who acts nice to hide her true intentions. What happened to the woman who told Tally to her face, "You can die ugly for all I care"? As we already mentioned, Paris doesn't really have a personality, but neither does David. And with Tally being more responsible for his father's death in the film than the book, I can't believe how quickly he seems to forgive her. In Tally's case, I felt like her intelligence wasn't as clearly expressed as it could have been. Sure, we see her sneaking into Pretty Town and tricking her room, but the film doesn't make it clear how difficult those things are to do. More times than not, it just seems like she got lucky. There are some instances in the book where we see her come up with clever ideas to defeat Dr. Cable's soldiers, but in the movie, her wins feel like plot armor. Even her journey to the smoke, which is supposed to be incredibly difficult, feels like a breeze, although that might be a pacing issue more than a character problem. Another thing I think the film misses out on is Tally's family dynamic, or the lack of it to be more precise. In the books, the different generations are separated, making their familial ties weaker and making it easier to control them. Not only do you not grow up with your parents, but after the surgery, you don't resemble them either, and after a certain point, you effectively become strangers. While we barely see Tally's parents in the film, in the book they help convince her to follow Shay and become pretty, being just as shallow and self-serving as the other pretties. If they incorporated her parents into the film more, they could have shown the more bizarre aspects of their society that had been normalized, as well as the impact of the pretty surgery on a larger scale. It also would have made David's family look even more loving, which would then make his father's murder more brutal. I had suspected that translating the uglies, pretties, and specials from the page to the screen would be a difficult task, but the film did an even worse job of it than I expected. First of all, none of the uglies are actually ugly, especially the people at the smoke. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised, considering the average actor is conventionally attractive, but I thought they would do something to make them look a bit off. Or at the very least, they could have gotten rid of their ugly nicknames, since Paris's nose isn't actually that big, and Tally's eyes aren't very squinty. A big part of the pretty surgery is making people symmetrical, so I wish they'd done an effect on half of the actor's face, so it was ever so slightly different from the other half. Then, when they become pretty, it could have been their normal faces. Now that actually would have been the opposite of how it works in the novel, with normal faces being considered ugly in their universe, but as we saw in the movie, that doesn't really translate to modern audiences. The pretty effect that they wound up going for is laughably bad, with the characters looking like they have the bold glamour filter on at all times. Now I'm not opposed to a sort of uncanny valley type of look for the pretties, but I think that should have been accomplished without the cut creases and terrible contacts. If I'm being honest, it just looks like they were given a bad IG baddie transformation, which could have been on purpose, but it's totally distracting. In the books, it's made clear that the different surgeries lead to very different results, with the pretties and specials looking totally unlike one another. While the pretties are like Barbie dolls with big lips and eyes, the specials are more wolf-like, with sharp, pointed features that make them look terrifying. But in the film, the only noticeable difference between the two is their eye color. Paris isn't a special in the books, but Dr. Cable is, something you might not have caught in the film since she looks so similar to the rest of the pretties. Tally often describes her as a cruel beauty, being so imposing that people are stunned into silence by her presence. In the movie, she's definitely pretty, but scary? I don't think so. The film didn't have the biggest budget, which I think is most apparent from the bland and boring costume design. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. I'll cut the dorm uniforms some slack since they're meant to be drab, but if they weren't going to commit to a single look for all of the uglies, then I'd wish they'd had Tally change her outfits more, at the very least to help show the passage of time. We don't see much of New Pretty Town, but their attire is nothing interesting, which is a shame because I think there was potential. If you read the book, you can tell it's influenced by its time period, with the hoverboards, belly rings, and vapid socialites coming across as incredibly 2000s. Considering 2000s fashion has made a comeback in recent years, it would have been great to see that incorporated into the uglies world, as the combination of the 2020s and 2000s could have resulted in a truly unique look, like a modern xenon or something. With the early 2000s being all about materialism and artifice, it could have solidified the film's themes while also highlighting how different the Smoke is from the rest of their world. But instead, the dorm uniforms and what the Smokies wear are basically identical, just with the latter having a bit more color. Even Dr. Cable's outfits, which are the most experimental in the film, are derivative of the female villains that came before her, with her tailored, monochromatic looks being eerily reminiscent of President Coin in The Hunger Games, Seeker in The Host, Ava Page in Maze Runner, and Janine Matthews in Divergent. Honestly, all of the film's visuals are indistinguishable from other dystopian YA series, with the rebels living in the woods, the opposing faction in glossy skyrises, and the lower class in dingy gray cubes. All of the technology, like the bungee jackets, morphos, and hoverboards, seem firmly rooted in the aesthetics of the 2010s with their minimalistic designs, which I find incredibly uninspired. Something more stylized, like Spy Kids or Back to the Future, would have been way more fun. At the very least, I wish that they'd made rusty technology, like the helicopters and buildings, look more ancient and run down, instead of being identical to the rest of the world, just without neon lights. Speaking of neon lights, I actively hate the suit the specials wear, which looks like a bad Tron knockoff. Even though the movie was released long after the YA craze, I do think that uglies had potential, especially in this day and age where we're seeing elementary schoolers with skincare routines and 19-year-olds with Botox. Instead of focusing so much on the action, I wish there'd been more of an emphasis on self-acceptance and inner beauty, which isn't as common in YA fiction as rebellion. With Netflix taking over 2 years to release the film, I have a feeling they were trying to decide whether or not they should shelve it, which honestly wouldn't have been such a bad idea. Considering how much of a dud this movie was, and the fact that the books weren't that popular to begin with, I doubt that Hollywood will ever revisit Uglies, but if they do, I hope they go with an animated series. I think it'd be the only way to capture the visuals in the books, while also setting it apart from the rest of the dystopian YA genre. What did you think of Uglies? I hope you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!